Well, good morning, everyone. This is Deacon Tim Wyman here, and it's 10 o'clock on Thursday morning, so that must mean it's time for the Parish Coffee Hour with Father Paul and friends. So I want to welcome everybody. I looked out my window. We got some snow overnight, so it's beautiful outside here at our place and hopefully outside of your place. So hopefully the next hour we're going to have a great conversation, and so I'm going to turn it over to Father Paul and let him get us started. Morning, Father Paul.
Good morning. Good morning, and welcome, Dr. Melinda Moore from EKU in the Department of Psychology. I think also a member of our parish and one who's been quite an expert in the area of, it's a delicate area, but an important area of suicide and particularly what survivors go through. I think of the holidays, and almost all of us have memories of watching It's a Wonderful Life, and we have this vision of Jimmy Stewart on a snowy day being on top of the bridge and ready to go, and then he gets to that insight of how his life has made a difference. And it's almost like a romantic look at suicide. And I think of even just as simple as a phone conversation last night with a friend of mine, and she was saying, yeah, and it was in the paper today, one more 12-year-old boy took his life, and he must have been so lonely. And you just think of all that was ahead for this young man, and all that's gone. So we'll get right to it. And how prevalent is suicide, Dr. Moore?
Father Paul, Deacon Tim, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to share some slides, and maybe this might explain better through the graphics how prevalent suicide is. But first, I wanted to let you know that I added a special picture here of Skellig Michael off the coast of County Kerry in Ireland. This is the monastery on Skellig Michael, and this is one of the crosses in the cemeteries where it's my understanding that the priests were buried. The individuals who came with, there were 12 disciples and a bishop apparently lived on Skellig Michael. So I wanted to show that to you all this morning. That was kind of special.
It looked to me like somebody who's leaning to the side, either ready to fall or coming back. And
either way, but it's a beautiful place and a very sacred place. And this is a sacred time where we're talking about a topic that is delicate, but it's also so important.
Yes,
it's critical to issues of life. And in the New York Times this Sunday, it's so important. This article about student suicides is on the front page of the New York Times. The superintendent of Clark County Schools out in Las Vegas is actually considering reopening schools because they've had a number, I think 17 or 18 young people die by suicide in recent months. And they're feeling that the isolation, the lack of resources, all of these things are contributing to these deaths. So they're talking about this, even in spite of the risk of infection, they're still concerned about the well-being of the young people. When we think about the problem of suicide, what's interesting is the science around suicide is pretty new. It's only about 50 years old, but it's been in the last 20 years that we've really developed a science, what we call suicidology, or in my case, I'm a clinical suicidologist. So I study suicide. I have some expertise in prevention, intervention, and then management of it. But then also when the worst happens, I work with the bereaved. So the data that we have around the prevalence of suicide, the quality of the data is getting better and better each year. Typically, we collect data at the state level, and then it's reported to CDC, and then it doesn't get reported back out again for 2 years. So the most recent data that we have is from 2018, and there were 48,000 Americans who died by suicide that year. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact of COVID-19 and the potential for increases in suicide death. There's some controversy around that. And again, that was what the New York Times article was talking about. How much is COVID-19 going to impact our suicide rates? But when we think about the people that are impacted by, who die by suicide more frequently, typically we're thinking about men. Men tend to die by suicide more frequently than women. Women attempt suicide more frequently than men, though. Men die, however, because they tend to use more lethal means. And when we think about the age ranges that are impacted most, typically we think about the people that are on either ends of the age spectrum. So the young people, young adults, adolescents, 15 to 24 years of age, and then those individuals who are 65 years of age plus, particularly men. So these are considered to be sort of the high risk groups. But in 2010, we saw an uptick of people in the middle of their lives, both men and women, 35 to 64 years of age. And there's some thinking at the time that perhaps this was related to the economic downturn of 2008, because when we think about the data that was coming out in 2010, it was 2008 deaths that we were talking about. So there is evidence to show a relationship there. Along with this new science around suicide that's been developed is a nomenclature. You know, the language that we use is always important. We're always changing the language that we use to be more appropriate, to be more sensitive, to be more specific. And what we do now is we use certain language around suicide. It's just more sensitive and it's more descriptive. So for instance, we now use terms like died by suicide or completed suicide as a way of more sensitively characterizing this cause of death. But we really try to have sort of rid ourselves of this concept of committing suicide. We no longer use that term in the vernacular because it does suggest a crime has been committed. And it further stigmatizes the individual who's died by suicide, reduces help seeking among those who are concerned about the stigma of help seeking and being suicidal. But it also really injures the individuals who are left behind in the wake of these deaths. So we really have changed our language around this as well. There are about 1.4 million Americans who attempt suicide every year. We call these individuals suicide attempt survivors. But suicidal ideation is actually pretty ubiquitous. About 10.6 million Americans experience serious suicidal thoughts each year. I've got lots and lots of information about that. And if anybody wants to email me and find out more, I can always tell you more about it. But when we think about suicide in terms of cause of death, it's always been in the top 10 leading causes of death, although COVID-19 will probably push it out for the foreseeable future because so many hundreds of thousands of people have died by COVID-19. But the thing that suicide is different and why it's such a problem is it's the only top 10 cause of death that continues to show significant increases each year. All the other ones, except COVID-19, are static. And suicide is not, it's fluid and it continues to increase. So this is a problem, going to continue to be a problem until we really address it nationally. So Father Paul, did you have something you wanted to ask me about? Because I can move on about the burden side.
Yeah, is that a worldwide problem as much as it is a US problem in terms of the increase of suicide?
It is a worldwide problem. In fact, the World Health Organization has showed a lot of leadership on worldwide suicide prevention. And the things differ though, depending upon the culture. So the individuals who die by suicide in Asia tend to be women and they tend to die in a very different way. But yes, suicide is a worldwide problem. So in terms of the burden of suicide, we no longer think about just the individuals who are dying by suicide or there's those first degree family members. Typically, we think about first degree family members as being most impacted. Because of this new science, and actually led by a psychologist in the College of Social Work at UK, Dr. Julie Searle, I was really honored to be on her research team when she began uncovering some really interesting data, probably 5 or 6 years ago, around what we call the continuum of survivorship. So the individuals that we find are most impacted are those who are exposed to the suicide death, but then have a sense of closeness to the individual who has died. So we're not necessarily talking about first degree relatives. We could be talking about next door neighbors or people who go to church together or people who are in sports teams together. But how we conceptualize this is that there are people who are suicide exposed, people who are exposed to the death, like the young man who died by suicide. It was reported in the paper. The person you were on the phone with talked to you about. Everybody who knew this young man would be considered to be suicide exposed. People reading the newspaper would be considered to be suicide exposed. But then those who are affected and bereaved short and long term would be in these sort of concentric nested circles, and they would be considered to be kind of closer to that individual. And so when we think about these different kinds of relationships, we're thinking about, it can be any person. Like I said, somebody who goes to school with this individual, they're on a sports team, a family member, a caregiver, a therapist, the person who finds the body. We even think of first responders, people who do like hospitality kind of work in a hotel, or people who are part of a cleaning staff in a hotel or an office. So it could be really anybody, but it's this perception of closeness that really predicts the impact of the death. And when we think about the individuals who are exposed, we now know, because of the research done by Dr. Julie Searle and her research team, that 135 people are exposed to each suicide death. For years, we would report in clinical suicidology, we would report this number 6, and that there was no data to support this number, that there were 6 individuals who were impacted. Actually, we now know that there are 135 people who are exposed. And what we know is that of those 135, there are approximately 36.1 that report that they are close or highly close to the decedent. And they're not necessarily first degree relatives. Again, they could be people that they know through school, through work, through church, through some sort of social activity. And it's this perception of closeness that really predicts the impact of this death upon them. And what we found in our study at UK is that those individuals who are exposed have statistically higher levels of depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. So we now know, based upon this and other studies that have been done, that suicide exposure and impact can actually confer suicide risk. And when you talk to suicidal people who are suicide bereaved, people who have been left behind in the wake, and a lot of people, they don't even think of asking them how they're doing. They will oftentimes tell you, if you query them, I am really blue, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I'm having thoughts of suicide. This is not uncommon. In fact, suicide bereaved people, if truth be told, their dirty little secret is that oftentimes they think of suicide. And because I work with a lot of people who are suicidal, but then also those who are suicide bereaved, I kind of know this on the continuum. And I also know that people who perhaps belong to faith communities where they're not allowed to drink, certainly drugs would not be allowed, they think about suicide a lot. So we, in the scientific community, really conceptualize suicide as a kind of a maladaptive form of coping, much like drinking and drugging would be. So people who can't drink, they think about suicide a lot. And so there are a lot of people, and I can guarantee you this, in faith communities, that because of their faith, they're not allowed to drink, but they think about suicide a lot. And so that's really a problem, but it's also an opportunity for faith communities to really become a place where they can help these individuals. And also then when the worst has happened, really minister to the needs of those who are suffering. So when we think about some of the difficulties that are faced by survivors, these are some of the more common experiences of suicide survivors. A lot of questioning, sort of this prolonged and intense search for the reason why. Why did the person die by suicide? They're almost obsessed with the idea of why, because it's so confusing and it's so stigmatizing and it's very isolating. They're alone and people don't ask them how they're doing. And, people in their faith community or their social groups oftentimes, just don't know what to say. So they end up not saying anything at all. It's a very isolating experience. Also, suicide bereaved people oftentimes feel like they're responsible for the death. They must have done something wrong. And so they search for this, or they somehow had this magical thinking that they could have prevented the death. Also, because of the culture we live in, we're always looking for responsibility. People sometimes feel blamed for causing the problems that began the suicidal ideation to begin with. And unfortunately, caregivers, mothers and wives, usually are pointed to as, because men tend to die by suicide more frequently, oftentimes people tend to blame mothers and wives, or there's those caregivers. And so you see a lot of that. And then of course there's, as we said earlier, increased anxiety, certainly feelings of anger and shame among the survivors. So those are some of the reactions of people who have died by suicide. Father Paul, do you have any comments or questions, or? You're muted, unfortunately.
Yep.
So that's a lot right there. I think probably an important question would be why people are taking their lives. Why do they commit suicide?
Yeah.
And yet you kind of think, well, to get out of this, but there's also other reasons too, I think.
Yeah, it's complicated. This is the thing about suicide. Suicide is an incredibly complicated cause of death. It's a lot like homicide. It's difficult to predict. So I'm going to come back to this idea of the pandemic and sort of move on to the ideas of risk factors. We now, because of the science that we have around this, really have good ideas of risk factors. So what do you look for when you're looking for potential suicidality among with somebody who maybe has you a little worried? We've got risk factors, but the thing is that they're not going to predict anything. The best thing you can possibly do if there's somebody who just seems a little bit off, maybe they've had some losses in their life, is asking them, are you having thoughts of suicide? Because I really want to know if you were. And sometimes how you ask that question is as important as what you say to them. But yeah, I think if you see some of these risk factors in individuals, such as a previous suicide attempt or a mental health disorder, trauma and losses, serious illness, chronic pain, one of the things that how we understand suicide now is it's very much on a continuum. So people will think about suicide for a very long time before they actually engage in behaviors. But it's a lot like a chronic illness in that people get kind of worn down by it. They get fatigued, they get exhausted by it. Chronic pain, any kind of chronic illness can kind of do that to an individual as well. They get so worn down by it, but that they see that as the only solution to what their intense pain that they might be feeling. I don't mean just physical pain, but psychological pain as well. So that's really how we conceptualize suicide. But all these other things might also potentially, bring risk, such as alcohol and drug problems, social isolation. The day, the week, and the 6 months after inpatient discharge is really a high risk period, and then also access to lethal means. That's why it's really important that if you think somebody's at risk for suicide, it's very important to ask them, do they have a plan? And if their plan includes guns, or even if they have guns in the home, it's probably a good idea to secure them. Not pussyfoot around it, not be too concerned about somebody being upset with you. It's better to just tell them later, look, I've taken this really tempting means, very highly irreversible form of death out of your home because I want to save your life, because I want to see you live. So we've got some risk factor information, but we've also got theory, and this is the prevailing theory right now in the field. It's called the interpersonal theory of suicide. And this is probably the best way of thinking about suicide. Again, this is all retrospective. It's not prospective. We can't predict because prediction models just don't seem to work. Again, like with homicide, the best thing to do is to ask somebody if you're worried about them. But what we do know about suicidal individuals is oftentimes, this is one of the myths of suicide, that people are being selfish or that they're being cowardly. Well, actually, we've got lots of evidence to the contrary. Most people who are suicidal feel like they don't belong and they feel like they're a burden. So they have this sense of what we call thwarted belongingness. I'm alone. And then they don't feel like they're a burden. They feel like they're worth more to their loved ones dead than alive, and that they're burdensome to their loved ones. And this is really where, according to this theory, the desire for suicide occurs. And it's when you then are able to acquire what we call capability to enact lethal self-harm, or sort of this fearlessness, so that you become familiar with handling guns or knives or some other lethal form, or pills, that oftentimes you then have that acquired capability, that fearlessness. And so you are able to then enact that. And this is really how we think about suicide these days. Any other comments or questions? I did want to also say another thing about, in terms of risk factors. What we know is, in another high risk group are those individuals who are in the LGBTQ community. We know because the Trevor Project, which is an advocacy for LGBTQ youth, they're doing national surveys, and we know that something like 40% of all LGBTQ youth have had serious thoughts of suicide in 2020. And we know that oftentimes, based upon other studies, for a whole variety of reasons. In fact, I was part of a longitudinal study at EKU where we asked individuals who were transitioning, but it also included other LGBTQ community members, about their experiences of transitioning and their suicidality. And what we found was a lot of family invalidation. The horrible things that family members would say to them, oftentimes were drivers. So that, again, that sense of being a burden, of not belonging. And of course, what we know with a lot of individuals who are transitioning, they oftentimes have to take hormone shots. So they become very, very comfortable with the pain. So they actually acquire that capability. So we have to be really, really conscious of all the different communities who, because of their unique status, might be impacted by this. Father Paul or Deacon Tim, any comments or questions?
Yeah, I just had another question come in from our Facebook audience from
Mhm.
Jane, who says, first of all, thank you for this. And then she says, I hope the number of suicides as a result of clergy sexual abuse is included in the context of this forum. Bringing this topic out of the closet in this context of a faith community discussion is vital to healing.
I completely agree. I don't know of the data around that. I'm sure it exists somewhere. It's in the process of being researched. I cannot imagine, well, I do imagine the trauma
Yeah.
associated with clergy sexual abuse. My husband died by suicide many years ago, and it was asserted that he had been sexually abused by a priest. My husband was from Ireland, and as you know, that Ireland has had a lot of problems with suicide and clergy sexual abuse. So I know firsthand, and I have been impacted significantly by this abuse. But I just don't know the data around it. And I'm sorry, but I agree. We need to be talking about it. Really, though, abuse of any kind, whether it's any kind of domestic violence, abuse by parents to children, any kind of abuse can really confer this sense of not belonging, of being a burden, of not being worth it. So, I mean, I think when we think about abuse, we have to think about the umbrella abuse as well. I did want to say something about the COVID-19 pandemic. There's been a lot of concern that COVID-19, and a lot of people talked about the isolation. Isolation, of course, the New York Times article brought this up as well. The isolation that a lot of young people are experiencing might be impacting their mental health, and then as a result, spurring on more suicide. And so this article came out in JAMA in April 2020, really brought up a lot of really interesting factors. And there is evidence to show that it's possible that COVID-19 might increase suicide rates, such as this idea of, suicidal thoughts and feelings being associated with social isolation and loneliness. Again, going back to this idea of not belonging, it's really important. And then, of course, we have evidence from the SARS outbreak in 2003 that healthcare workers and individuals who quarantined showed symptoms of PTSD. So we've got that evidence. But I think the best evidence and the thing that's most concerning to me, especially among the hospitality industry, is this sustained economic stress and the job loss and the economic consequences of this. I'm
Mhm.
very concerned about the economic impact and what that will have on Americans, particularly, like I said, among hospitality, where you've got restaurants who are en masse, closing. And then, of course, a lot of employees, servers, hospitality industry folk are losing their jobs. And these are some of the most, kind of fragile, marginalized people in the world. But it's not just the hospitality industry. I read the other day that something like 1 in 8 churches in this country will basically go under because of the lack of financial support. So it's not just restaurants, it's lots of different businesses that we really rely upon and that sustain us. We know through other surveys, the Kaiser Family Foundation did a survey, and then Active Minds did a survey among college students, and we know that people are struggling, and we know that this COVID-19 pandemic is definitely negatively impacting people. And we know that college students are being seriously impacted. And of course, these are vulnerable individuals who oftentimes, they don't have the life experience to know that they can make it through a tragedy or a trauma or a difficulty. And so they're really questioning their futures. They're questioning whether they can make it, whether they can graduate. These are serious implications of this pandemic. What I know, though, because I talk to public health people all the time. I talk to people at CDC, I talk to my friends with the state of Kentucky, and I talk to people nationally, and I pay attention to what all the suicide prevention data experts are saying. And that is that we are not seeing currently, in the most current data that is being collected through the states, it hasn't been reported out yet, it's not official. We are not seeing an uptick in suicide rates. That's the good news. The bad news is that we are seeing, a lot of people in distress, particularly children and adolescents. And I can tell you, as somebody who's a supervisor in the clinic associated with the psychology department at EKU, we are definitely seeing a lot of college-age students, young adults, adolescents, children in distress. And we know that crisis text line, this is the national number, the 741-741 number, that a lot of young people use, a lot of adolescents, a lot of young adults are using. We know that there's been a 40% increase in crisis text line use since March. And anxiety was actually considered the top concern. In fact, 1 in 5 texters specifically mentioned the coronavirus. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline was not reporting higher call volume. However, the Disaster Lifeline was. So I think what's happening is we are seeing people in distress reaching out to the resources that are available. Thankfully, we have these resources that are available, but we're not seeing suicide death rates go up. My concern is what will happen long-term in terms of impact, particularly the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. We did have a question come in about heredity. There's been this controversy. There's been this question, is there a suicide gene? Actually, there's no such thing as a suicide gene, but we do inherit things like, depression. And so we know that depression, bipolar disorder, these mood disorders are heritable. And so when we think about individuals who die by suicide, there are people who definitely might be at risk because they have a mood disorder. But we also know that there are many roads to Rome. There are a lot of people who have these mood disorders who don't ever even think about suicide. And we also know that there are a lot of people, in fact, a couple of years ago, there was a report that came out from CDC, I think it was 2018, that showed over 50% of individuals who had died by suicide in the United States did not have a diagnosable mental disorder. So while it's a risk factor, it doesn't necessarily predict anything.
Related to that question, would there be some influence of, say, a family member who's taken their life, and that leads somebody then in the next generation to say, well, it's happened, and I'm going to consider it too. That socialization factor in addition to the organic.
Yeah, so that's another important thing to consider. Family history of suicide. We call that the sleeper effect. Sometimes you'll have a young person in a family die by suicide, and then suddenly after the death, it's revealed that their grandfather or their uncle died by suicide. But the family members never talked about it. And that's why it's important when there's a bit of suicide in the community, it's important to talk to your kids about this. It's important to be armed with information. Talking about it is not going to put it in their head. I liken this a lot to sex. Talking about sex with an adolescent is not going to put it in their head. They're already thinking about it. If they're thinking about it, they're already thinking about it. So, again, like with suicide, if they're thinking about suicide, they're already thinking about it. You're not going to put it in their head. But by talking about it, you might liberate them and make them feel free to talk about it. And then you can actually do something about it. Yeah. Suicidal ideation in and of itself is not going to kill you. But it's a lot like, like a strep throat or not feeling well. It's a red flag that you really need to get professional help. And the good news is that we now have treatment for suicide. I train all of our clinical psych doctoral students at EKU in suicide-focused treatments. So in our clinic, we actually treat people who are suicidal. The idea that, giving them antidepressants or taking them to the hospital, this is the standard of care in this country. That's what clinicians do. Somebody says suicide, and you immediately take them to the hospital. But you don't necessarily have to do that. And in fact, that may not be the best course of treatment for them. We now have evidence that shows that multiple hospitalizations may actually confer more long-term risk. So it's important to have that individual seen by somebody who's competent to treat them and make that evaluation, make that assessment. Do they go to the hospital or do they stay outpatient and have this very specialized treatment? That's the good news about the science of suicide. We now have treatments available. Factors talked about the theory. It's really important. I hope everybody who's on in this chat today has in their phone the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline number, 1-800-273-TALK, 8255. This is a critical number to have programmed in your phone because you never know if you're going to come across somebody who's in crisis. This is a 24/7 confidential toll-free number. These people are trained professionals. They're excellent. It's an excellent resource. This, frankly, should be in the bulletin of the church bulletin. It may be every time. I mean, this is a critical life-saving number. Now, in 2022, this number is going to be replaced by a 3-digit number, kind of like we have 911. Well, 988 will replace this number. So all you have to do is dial 988. But for this foreseeable future, until next year, we're going to still use this number. And this is a critical number. Another number for people, another important resource for people to have, crisis text line, 741-741. Again, 24/7 support via text. It's excellent. Everybody's trained. A lot of our clinical psych doctoral students actually are crisis text line counselors as well. This is an excellent training ground for people who are interested in helping others. Also, I would really encourage everybody, if they really want some help and they want to refer somebody to our clinic. Our clinic is excellent. We have a trauma and suicide prevention clinic that provides a broad range of services for trauma or for suicide-related issues, such as suicidal ideation or behaviors. And then when the worst has happened, we also have a suicide bereavement group, which I run at EKU. Any comments or questions before we get into the big elephant in the room about faith issues around suicide?
I'd like to ask, as you speak of women doing suicide or suicidal attempts, you speak of they're less, I guess when it's all said and done, less fatal or I think there's been a theory that sometimes it's a cry for help more than an attempt to take one's life. And it's almost like a statement, I can't live this way anymore. Can you say a little bit about that, and realizing there's all kinds of variables and no 100% accurate generalization?
Yeah, absolutely. This is such a good question, such a good issue to discuss. The thing is, women tend to use less lethal means. Men use more lethal means. Again, it goes back to that, acquired capability, men being more familiar with guns. You think about Kentucky's a hunting culture. Everyone seems to have an arsenal of guns. Everyone seems to like to go deer hunting. Men do it, not as many women do it. So men are more familiar, more comfortable with guns. Men who are in the military, that's why the military's had a problem with suicide, very comfortable with guns. Women maybe less so. The problem is that as women become more comfortable with guns, and I believe the state of Kentucky has seen this with some of their data around adolescent females, you then begin to see suicide rates increasing using this method, particular lethal means. Women tend to use less lethal means, such as pills, but we don't take that attempt or that action less seriously. The pain that they are in, just because they're using less lethal means, has nothing to do with their pain or the lack of what's driving their suicidality being real or being tangible or being a thing that could possibly lead to more lethal means. We take every suicidal act seriously. And I really have a problem with people who don't take adolescents seriously, because adolescents have less coping skills than we as adults have. They just don't know how to cope with difficulty, and they oftentimes don't see the consequences of their behavior. And so I think we have to take every utterance, every act very, very seriously. Cry for help is kind of an interesting term. I mean, it was actually characterized by a suicidologist, this cry for help idea. But I think it can also be pejorative. There can be kind of a diminishment of the realness behind the pain that's behind that act. And so I think we have to take every act, whether it's lethal or not as lethal, very seriously.
I've heard over the years that you could almost look at a suicide from three angles of the desire to hurt myself, the desire to escape, the desire to hurt others. And again, not moralizing, just saying this is what's going on with somebody who's really, really hurting.
Yeah.
How would you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think going back to that interpersonal theory of suicide, what we know about suicidal people because of the new science around this is that people are in pain and they really see themselves as a burden. They don't see themselves belonging to communities, and I think this idea of a revenge suicide is again kind of a diminishment of the kind of pain people are really in. I'm sure they exist. I know they exist, but I don't think the majority of suicides would be characterized as, the drive being a revenge. People tend to do things that are in, their best interest. And so that's why a lot of suicidal people are ambivalent. It's not that they want to die. They don't want to live in the pain that they're in.
Yeah.
They oftentimes feel, like I said, like they're worth it to their family members. They feel like a burden. So actually it can be construed as a selfless act, not an act of selfishness.
Mm-hmm.
It's very difficult to kill yourself. So it's not a cowardly act either. It actually takes a lot of courage. But I think the science around this has really helped us understand this much more clearly.
Has there been research on suicidal notes?
Yeah. Actually, yeah, it's interesting. Suicidal notes. So how we tend to think of individuals who are at the end of their lives and contemplating suicide and maybe right there at the precipice of death, and they might write a suicidal note. Oftentimes what we know from suicide note research, and I've actually been involved in some suicide note research, we know that they don't convey profound information usually. Usually it conveys very kind of banal, like, feed the dog, make sure you pay the bills, that kind of stuff. And the idea is, and now this is the majority, I'm not saying all of them, but the majority of them do. Now, most people don't leave a suicide note. Only about 15% of people who die by suicide leave a note. The overwhelming majority don't. And a lot of family members feel like, if they're not left a note, that maybe, it feels even more rejecting to them. But actually, it's not common to leave a note. And a lot of the notes that are left behind really don't tell you anything tangible about that person's state of mind, probably because they're in this dissociative state and they're really not thinking clearly.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, Melinda, a lot of times with this program, I drive the bus, but I feel like I'm riding shotgun. So why don't you take us to the next place? It seems like you want to talk a bit about faith and all, and that's really important. Because a lot of times people say it's a sin, and let's go there.
Before we get to the faith thing, I do have a question myself about, let's say the person who, like they what's the right terminology? I don't want to say, so they completed the suicidal act. And then you look at, and you saw, and there were people who said, they kind of saw the signs, right? They tried, and then there's the person who you hear about it, and you're like, where did that come from? And I didn't know if there was any. Are there people like that like truly there was no signs, or were we just missing the signs?
Yeah, I think both. I think there are a lot of people. Like now, knowing what I know now, I now saw the signs. I see retrospectively, I now see the signs. But at the time, I didn't know what to look for. And I think that happens with a lot of people. They become very educated and informed after the fact, and they're like, oh, now I see. So I think that happens a lot. The thing is, if people don't tell you they're suicidal, you can't possibly know. And there are people who hide it. A lot of people hide it. And I think a lot of men hide it because it's seen as weakness. I was talking to a young man last night in my private practice, and he explicitly told me that he thought this was weakness. And I think that's why it's such an important cultural issue that we educate young men and young women that help seeking is actually a strength, not a weakness.
Yeah.
Because unfortunately, they see this as a weakness. And so this is not just an issue of science or clinical work or medicine or psychology. It's a big cultural issue around taking care of yourself and not feeling asking for help is a problem. Yeah. So, the 800-pound gorilla in the room is, why is it so difficult for so many people to be people of faith and yet somehow feel like you can, pray for the individual who's died by suicide or feel good that they're with God? And I think this is such a complicated issue when it comes to our practice of faith. I know myself, I was a new Catholic when my husband died by suicide. And I really wondered, not only did I want to know why, but I wanted to understand why God would do this to him and why God would do this to me. And how do I understand this within the practice of my faith? Because everything I was being told was my husband committed a sin, and somehow by association, I shared in the taint of his sin. So that was my experience, but this was many years ago. Wow. And Father Ron Rolheiser is really has been a leader in the field, in sort of the faith community, talking about suicide. He writes apparently a column every year, but I think this quote by him is really important. All death unsettles us, but suicide leaves us with a very particular series of emotional, moral, and religious scars. It brings with it an ache, a chaos, a darkness, and a stigma that has to be experienced to be believed. Sometimes we deny it, but it's always there, irrespective of our religious and moral beliefs. That's why suicide is very different than other causes of death. It is considered a sudden and traumatic death like other causes of death, like combat, like car accidents. But because it's self-inflicted and because it conflicts with some of our more sort of life-affirming messages, particularly within our faith, it's a real conflict. And why is that? Well, it's interesting because if you look at the Bible, and I'm now driving in your lane, Father Paul. But if you look at the Bible, the Bible doesn't say a whole lot about suicide. It's not very definitive. There are only a handful of stories of suicide in the Bible, and they're not real definitive. We have St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas to thank for the real sort of condemning attitudes that the Catholic Church embraced early on and really seemed to kind of follow up to about the mid-1960s. It's my understanding that Vatican II really began the change around how we treated suicide decedents and began talking about suicide. And then, of course, later, as the science around suicide and mental illness, understanding all those psychological and sociological, impacts on culture and on the church, we began to kind of loosen sort of our attitudes. But St. Augustine was really the first one to equate the sixth commandment, thou shalt not murder, to suicide. And St. Thomas Aquinas just sort of, drilled that nail into the coffin in terms of, really asserting it is altogether unlawful to kill oneself. Hence, suicide is always a mortal sin, as being contrary to the natural law and to charity. And of course, then others followed. Others brought up the idea that it cuts off the possibility of repentance, and in fact, even suggested that it was inspired by demon possession, and it was a crime. Again, this is why we don't use the term committed suicide, because it suggests it's a crime. And then also those individuals were condemned, and then they were forbade, a Christian burial and burial in a churchyard. The current Roman Catholic view is, we don't endorse suicide, obviously. As a clinical psychologist, I don't. I am empathic with the pain that people are in, why they might get to that place, but I never endorse it. And the Catholic Catechism currently says, we are stewards, not owners of the life God has entrusted to us, and thus our lives are not ours to dispose of. However, suicide is influenced by grave psychological disturbances. Anguish or grave fear of hardship, suffering or torture can diminish the responsibility of the one, I'm not going to say the word, of killing themselves. And so we are much more, it's tempered, again, by our understanding the science, the psychology, sort of the cultural influences on our understanding of this very confusing act. Father Charles Ruby he's been a leader in this field for a number of years, and he says, there are still some priests who view suicide as a mortal sin that has been categorically denied by church leadership.
Yep.
It is critical to the healing process for priests and church leaders to talk openly with parishioners and avoid fear-mongering over the church's view of suicide. Problem is that in seminary, priests are not taught how to think about, they're not taught the science of this. They're not taught how to preach about suicide. And if you only bring your own personal experiences to the table, and this goes for clergy of all sorts, people who go to seminary, people who don't go to seminary, people, who are in these, non-denominational churches, if you bring your own experiences to this and aren't learning the science or the theory around this, you can't possibly know what to say. So it's not as if somebody's at fault. We just haven't known how to conceptualize this or how to think about this. Father Paul, Deacon Tim, any thoughts about this, or before I move on?
No.
I agree with you totally, and you can imagine we do have funerals of people who've taken their lives, and it's so important to not say anything definitive in terms of the whys, the wherefores, and where they're going, and just to be present to the folks and to trust God's goodness in the mystery of life.
That's right. That's right. The good news is we have resources today. Deacon Ed Shiner and Bishop John Dolan have written 2 books that just came out. In fact, I was very honored to write a chapter in each one of these books on my area of research, which is called post-traumatic growth. So while we know awful things happen in the aftermath of these experiences with traumatic loss, I'm also exploring what else is possible. And so, but responding to suicide, a pastoral handbook for Catholic leaders just came out. And then for those individuals who've had a loved one die by suicide, the second book just came out, When a Loved One Dies by Suicide, Comfort, Hope, and Healing for Grieving Catholics. These are so information rich and such wonderful resources. We have other resources as well. I hate to be an endless self-promoter, but my colleague, Rabbi Dan Roberts, and I edited a book a couple of years ago called The Suicide Funeral or Memorial Service, Honoring Their Memory, Comforting Their Survivors. And this book really was kind of first of its kind. And it was actually a book that I was supposed to write with somebody else. I'm going to tell you about it here in a second. But this book is a collection of not only just the best science around how to think about suicide, but also a collection of template homilies and sermons, and then also perspectives from a broad range of faith leaders. Broad range of faith perspectives are represented: Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, Protestant, people, how do you conduct a service for an individual who dies by suicide from a sort of a, not an agnostic, but sort of a non-faith-based way, in a way that's appropriate. We've got template homilies and sermons for individuals like that. Jim Clemens, Reverend Jim Clemens, he was a biblical scholar at Wesley Theological Seminary, was a very dear friend of mine. He wrote a number of books. He was a Bible scholar, but he also was an advocate in the area of suicide prevention and faith community, sort of that intersection of the two. And he wrote a number of books. The seminal book, What Does the Bible Say About Suicide? It's out in print, and it's really kind of groundbreaking and just as pertinent now as it was then, but then also Children of Jonah, about suicide attempt survivors, perspectives on suicide. Reverend Jim Clemens and I were supposed to write this book, the Suicide Funeral book, together. And unfortunately, he was killed. It was an accident. And so Rabbi Dan Roberts, who's also a thanatologist and suicide bereaved by his father's death, he and I finished the book together. And so I'm deeply grateful for this experience. My colleague, Chaplain Glenn Bloomstrom, though, he works for Living Works, and they have just developed a training that I was involved in helping to put together. This is really for faith leaders. It's a online training. I just wanted to let you guys know about it because I know you want to know about resources that are available for people of faith, clergy, lay faith leaders, people who care deeply about their faith, but also care deeply about what can we do about suicide? How do we prevent it within our communities, within our congregations, within our faith communities? When the worst happens, how do we comfort and minister to the needs of the individuals who are left behind? Another resource I want to point out to everybody is this wonderful organization called the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention's Faith Communities Task Force. The National Action Alliance is actually a public-private, it's a national public-private partnership that's really enacting the blueprint for suicide prevention in the United States. And it has a number of task force, and Faith Communities Task Force is one that I'm involved in, deeply honored to be the co-lead of. And I just would encourage everybody to go to the Faith Hope Life website and look at all the wonderful resources. We have lots of great resources, all sample prayers, webinars. We did a webinar last spring on how do we strengthen faith communities during the COVID-19 pandemic, all sorts of communication tools for bulletins, all sorts of templates, great things. We also launched the suicide prevention competencies among faith leaders. So this was a document that was steeped in science. There are a number of people on our task force who are scientists as well as people of faith. And Dr. Karen Mason, who wrote really a seminal book on suicide prevention competencies for chaplains and faith leaders, sort of spearheaded this effort to develop competencies for clergy. You can download this document from our website. We also, every year, September is Suicide Prevention Month, and we, for several years, had National Weekend of Prayer during September, but now we've moved it to May. And actually, we're going to have it this May 14th to 16th. And the idea is that we're going to recognize the entire weekend because we recognize that not all people of faith worship on Sunday. And so we want to include everybody in this National Weekend of Prayer. And the idea is that what we do already naturally as faith community members is pray. We can pray for people in our congregations who are suicidal or who are struggling, people who might be struggling with something that might put them at risk for suicide, or for people who have made an attempt, or for people who have lost a loved one to suicide. And so I really encourage you to go to the Faith Hope Life website and pledge to participate, and then promote it within your faith community. The price.
Let me grab the wheel of the bus just for a moment or so.
Sure.
I think we've still got a couple questions that would be really important. And they're different. One would be if there's like a teen who's doing self-harm, like cutting or something like that. Is there a relationship between that and a potential suicide? So hold that a second. And then if you could wrap up by saying, what kind of things happen? How often do they meet? Who are the participants in a suicide survivors group? That would be really important for our audience to hear too.
Yeah. So non-suicidal self-injury or cutting and suicidal behavior with intent are separate, but they're overlapping ideas or constructs. And we tend to think of people who get desensitized to pain or use cutting as a form of coping sort of on that suicide continuum. So in our clinic, we treat them identically. We will address the non-suicidal where there's no intent to kill yourself, but you're cutting, you're doing something maladaptive to cope with your pain. And so we would treat them identically.
Good.
I encourage anybody who's got a teenager doing that to either call the Department of Adolescent Medicine at University of Kentucky. They have excellent clinicians there who are expert in this, and then or the EKU Psychology Clinic. We have clinicians who are expert in this as well. We would treat them all very similarly. So in terms of how to get involved, well, I would encourage everybody to go to the Faith Hope Life website, take a look at, the National Weekend of Prayer information, pledge, participate, and promote it. And I also have, as I said before, I have a suicide bereavement group. And if you are interested, if you are suicide bereaved and would like to attend my group, I've got my email address at the end of this presentation. Feel free to email me and we will talk about that.
Do you have members who have attempted suicide and survived, or do they have a different kind of thing they belong to?
Yeah, so people who have attempted suicide are called suicide attempt survivors, and people who have lost a loved one are called suicide bereaved or suicide survivors. They're really different groups, although sometimes suicide bereaved people become suicidal. But we don't really have groups for suicide attempt survivors. I would encourage anybody who's made an attempt to stay in therapy, to have, you deserve that support of a professional in that particular experience. It is considered a trauma. A lot of suicidal people consider their suicide attempt a trauma, and I think they deserve that kind of intensive treatment. People who are bereaved, we also offer individual psychotherapy for people who are bereaved. A lot of people, though, feel like there's something about this group support that's really powerful. Now, I also wanted to give a little shout out to another parishioner, Barb Ford.
Yes.
Who facilitates the Lexington Survivors of Suicide group. This is an excellent resource in Lexington. This group is held at the Church of the Good Shepherd in Lexington. Barb is an excellent facilitator. Again, a prime example of somebody who's made lemonade out of lemons and is giving back and helping people in this incredibly traumatic experience of loss. So I'm happy to provide information on the Lexington Survivors of Suicide group, as well as the EKU Survivors of Suicide group. If anybody wants to email me, I'm happy to hook them up with either group because they're both wonderful resources. But theirs meets every Monday and mine meets every other Monday, every 2 weeks as opposed to every week. One of the things that you can also do is to get involved in the National Weekend of Prayer. I think the National Action Alliance Faith Communities Task Force has been incredibly fortunate to have the support of Christ the King Cathedral, Father Paul, Bishop John Stowe in our efforts the last for a couple of years to support the National Weekend of Prayer. It's been in the bulletin. This is actually the bulletin a couple of years ago. This is the bulletin on World Suicide Prevention Day, September 10th. where you all posted in your bulletin resources, information about this important acknowledgement, but then also the cause of death, and then also other resources in the community. And of course, here's Bishop John Stowe, the man really responsible for allowing me to bring this to the Diocese of Lexington, this important issue, and allowing me to have a voice and a platform to really help those individuals who are suffering in silence, because we know that there are people not only within our community of faith, but also just within our community who desperately need the support of the church. They need to have people in leadership, people like Father Paul, people like Bishop John, saying things about this from the pulpit. It is very critical to have leaders demonstrate that it's okay to talk about suicide. We're not going to put it in people's heads, but there's actually resources. And if you're thinking about it, please access those resources. Please demonstrate some strength. It's not a weakness by asking for help. And the church is also there to provide spiritual support. It's not a moral failing, but it is definitely something that's treatable. And there's lots of resources in our community to get help. So I really appreciate you, Father Paul, Deacon Tim, and of course, I'm always deeply indebted to Bishop John Stowe for his leadership on this topic. And I'm always willing to answer any email or any query or help people in any way. So please don't, feel free to email me.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Let's see if we have any questions out there or comments yet, Deacon Tim. And we're getting pretty close to our end time, but
yes, it
we'll
is.
Where we go.
Yeah, it's probably a little late to get in. There was a follow-up question, but honestly, we're almost at the end of our time, so it's probably not going to do it justice. So,
just a final quickie, Melinda. How do you take care of yourself?
Well, I have a couple of things. Number one, my practice of faith. I do miss coming. I'm a parishioner virtually, and then I also attend the Diocese of Raphoe in Letterkenny, Ireland. So I go about 4 different services every Sunday. I think I'm attending, it's called the Little Way Sunday School in Ireland. I think it's for kids, but I love it. So one of the benefits of this pandemic has been the fact that I can attend multiple faith community services on Sunday or any other day of the week, really. And that's been wonderful. And then also I am very engaged in agility dog training. My dog Claudette and I do agility dog training out in Versailles at Littlefield Dog Training every Wednesday. And we love that. And we do agility trials when we're able. Haven't done so many during the pandemic, but being in nature, being with my dog, being with my faith community, being with my husband, being out in nature, these are all things ways in which I take care of myself.
Well, great. Thank you very much. It's just an enlightening and I think very, very helpful program we've had today. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Father Paul.
Next week, I think we'll have another guest, and I think he would also qualify as one who would be a bus driver. And we got Father Larry Heeman with us. So we'll talk about his ministry, his life and his ministry as a priest. And it should be a great program, and look forward to you being with us then. Once again, Melinda, thank you so much for being with us. This has been great. Thanks for giving of yourself and this program and all else you do. God bless you.
All right, so we'll be back a week from today at 10 o'clock next Thursday, and Father Larry will be joining us, and hopefully everybody out there listening will come back and have a great conversation with Father Paul and Father Larry. So until next week, have a great time.
And Melinda, just stay on with us. We debrief for a couple of minutes afterwards,
Okay.
and
Sure.
that's always kind of fun too. So again, thanks